to have?
No.
You're okay?
It's just a Greek salad with some Swiss chard.
On top, yeah.
And while I made some rice for the Swiss chard and some peas I cooked. So
it's a salad with some chard on top. It's almost like a musical.
Yeah, yours I did
song,
very different.
Right? A curry with a fringe on top.
Yeah, because I wanted to make some Swiss chard because we've been eating Swiss chard lately, and I don't know, I bought it. I hate buying it because I know how easy it is to grow it, and I should be growing it.
It grows like a weed, eh?
Yeah, it grows really well. So it's something that everyone should grow for themselves. And I used to grow it, and then my garden became permanent. Like now I only have the peat bales, and so I haven't been. I've been growing tomatoes in the bales, not chard. Anyway.
Garden filled in with flowers.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
Well, and the cherry trees shaded, whatever.
Yeah.
Things grew up. So.
Well, anyway. One cherry tree became several.
Like, my neighbor was over talking to us yesterday.
Yeah, we had a good conversation.
And James and her, they'd known some of the same people and stuff. Like,
many
in younger years. Yeah. And so they were talking about people, and they were talking. It got onto cabbage rolls, and then James mentioned that my grandma had made cabbage rolls. He didn't try my grandma's cabbage rolls.
No.
He tried.
I got the recipe.
Well, I guess you did, because Pam gave it to you, didn't she? But my aunt makes like. I think she knows all of my grandma's recipes now. So she makes the cabbage rolls exactly the same. So
very good cabbage rolls.
Yeah. And I do not. I do not make my cabbage rolls like my grandma.
Well, you make very good cabbage rolls too.
But I make cabbage rolls with Swiss chard, and it's way easier. I think I only did cabbage rolls the proper way with cabbage once. And that was enough. I was like, boy, this blanching the leaves first business, that's for the dogs. I'm not doing that. So I figured out, well, if you do it with Swiss chard, you cut out the stem, which I've given James all of the stems because I figure, well, there's a lot of color there, so it's probably healthy. And so I thought, well, I'll give him the... But when making the cabbage rolls, I cut out the stems, and then you make your rice and stuff and whatever to put in it, and you don't have to cook the rice beforehand. You can make it like a dolmati. So if you're making dolmatis, you don't cook the rice. You just, fry up your onions and stuff like that, and then you put it with that, and then you put it inside in case of dolmatis, it's the grape leaf. In the case of the cabbage rolls, how I make it with Swiss chard, it's the Swiss chard leaf. So you stick it in there, and then you roll it up, and then you stick it in like your rice cooker on the bottom. You get a big rice cooker I have several sizes, and for making the rolls you use a big one. So then you put them all, you tuck them real tight in together in a layer, and if you have enough you're doing, you could do a couple layers or whatever, but you put a big plate that's the size upside down, heavy ceramic, on top of them, and then you put the water, and then you cook, because you don't want them lifting up or you won't have rolls. But yeah, that's all you do. Way easier that way.
Wish we had ambient music instead. We got ambient noise.
Instead of the noise, yeah.
They're fixing up
it
a
is
place
nice
in the
they're fixing
neighborhood.
Up the place.
Yeah.
Whatever.
They've been doing it for several months now.
So
they had
James.
a murder there a while back. We're not going to say what place. And I think they're trying to clean up
Their
the
image? Yeah. So anyway, James is going to talk about his road atlas. He goes through this thing daily, a lot.
Okay.
He has several atlases.
I have many actually. Many. I've ones that I prefer to go through. So this is a Rand McNally. All new editions, not so all new anymore. It's all new when it came up, presumably. 1998. Presumably they come out with one every year. So this is the ultimate road atlas and vacation guide for the United States, but you can also say to a certain extent for North America. So they have the Canadian provinces here basically paired up. Quebec and Ontario get their own double spread. Western provinces paired up. They've kind of matched up. Excuse me, some of the eastern provinces. Mexico gets just one map, all in its lonesome. So they don't quite do justice to Mexico, but I don't know if I'd want to be road mapping it through Mexico. I'd want to fly someplace and go to the tourist locations. I think it'd be pretty dangerous. A person has to be very objective about the way things are. The American murder rate last time I checked was 4.7 per 100,000 people per year. So that would be like 4.7 murders in Lethbridge. Last time I checked, it's about 100,000. Last time I checked, it was quite a while back. Lethbridge would maybe get a murder a year. It's probably a little bit higher than that now. But, I'm told it's Lethbridge, with some of its satellite communities, is the most violent community in all of Canada. But Canada isn't very violent. England, last time I checked, it's probably changed with a variety of people filtering in. Many of them would be Pacific, relatively so. Not as Pacific on average as English people, or British people, I should say. But they'd be getting some people who just don't really believe in pacifism. There's a particular group of people that go say, Christians believe in turning the other cheek. We don't believe in turning the other cheek, and they're proud of that. So and that's been a formulation for a long time. It's not recent. It's not since the turn of the century, or a year after the turn of the century, or something like that. It's been a formulation for hundreds and hundreds of years. Christians turn the other cheek. We don't turn the other cheek. Yeah, I know. Don't have to say it to me. I know all about it. Or a lot about it. Too much about it, really. I'm too true to be good. Not too good to be true. Anyway, so this is a little a warning to you folks. Well, I'm going to say this might be the ultimate. It's the ultimate of the road atlases that I've run across, because it's got a vacation guide in here for each one of the states, not the provinces. Each one of the states, it has its own map, at least one page. Here's a double page for Florida. It's lying on its side here. Here it's a single page for Washington, D.C., which isn't even a state. Right? Here's a single page for Delaware. Well, Delaware is a pretty small state. It's not the smallest. I gather Rhode Island is, but it's one of the smallest. Double spread for Connecticut. It's not that large in terms of size, but it does have a fair amount of population, fairly large population. It's got a lot of larger places like Hartford, New Haven, and Stamford, and Waterbury, and on it goes. So it comes, if you're looking for one of these road atlas and stuff like that, it comes maybe even highly recommended. It's, like I say, it's the best that I've run across. So what it has is, probably at least one page for every state minimum describing some of the features to be found here, so in the states. So Kansas, there's one page of kind of like guides for tourists and stuff like that. I don't know exactly why some places are represented and other places aren't. I mean, Leavenworth, I mean, did they even mention the penitentiary there? I don't think they do. That's the place that I think it's in Kansas. There's other Leavenworths in the United States.
Because you want to go vacation there.
Oh, believe me, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
It is high security. I gather it would be wherever you got a high security. Presumably, you got high security risks and stuff like that. I think that's the one in Kansas that's a problem. I don't know if Jesse James and characters hung out there. No, it'd be more like where did they hang out? It's around. Actually, I think they were around Kansas City and Independence. They didn't. I don't know if they spread that far afield. I think maybe they ended up their lives somewhere around St. Joseph in Missouri, just across the Missouri River from Leavenworth and a little bit north and stuff like that. But here's a little, like heads up for you guys. See how the front page has come off? I didn't rip it off. Had it upside down. Back page came off. You can see now this is having to serve as a back page. It's not built for it. Dog-eared. I don't set out to have these things happen, but when you're going through it and see it's not actually that dirty, but I try to keep my hands relatively clean when I'm handling books and stuff like that, but you can see that I've sweated over this stuff. No, there's no blood and tears over this stuff, but there's lots of sweat. So I put in blood. I don't put blood in, but I put sweat in. I don't put tears in because I'm not a tortured artist or tortured whatever else. But there's lots of people who want to tell me about the United States. They've got all sorts of ideas about the United States, even I suppose Americans. Here's a little heads up, okay? You want to lecture me about the United States, you'd better have this kind of stuff not just gone through, but internalized. And it better be between your ears, because once you start yipping and yapping, flapping your gums, I know you don't have the stuff in there, and you're stereotyping, and you're doing all sorts of stupid, crazy garbage. America's a big place. It's much more than a third of quite a large continent. There's a lot of variety there. There's a lot of skunks. There's a lot of racists, real racists. Not people who, maybe have a tendency towards some sort of racial prejudice and stuff like that. There are a lot of nations inside the United States. In other words, there's a lot of First Nations, as they used to be called. Maybe they're still called that. Lots and lots of them. I try to memorize as many as possible. Where they were located, what are their names? I try to study their languages. Multiple ones, many ones. So if you want to yip and yap about the United States and lecture me about the United States, you can lecture other people, I suppose, because people you won't be exposing your ignorance to them. But you start lecturing me about the United States, you'd better have this stuff not just gone through like this. I have my ways of memorizing this stuff. It's not just mechanically going through things. I try data entry. You'd better have the stuff data entered into your brains. Don't start lecturing me until you've got, like if you're lecturing, you're kind of in a position of a teacher or a professor. Don't try lecturing me when I should be lecturing you. Okay? So that's just a little added note. I told you what's in here, but just an added note. I mean, Pauline doesn't like the way I batter and beat things up. I don't set out to do that.
I don't care about that.
And I've taken care of things. You know, like it's just having gone through them. I can't help it, right? Mm-hmm. It's not as though I'm clumsy and throwing the things all over the place and stuff like that. Up until recently, this was sitting up on a shelf, nice and purty. I take it down and go through it and so on and so forth. Then I was going through and trying to learn as many places. For example, in Ohio. Where did I get up to? Oh, it was about 700 places in Ohio. How many places can you name in Ohio if you're not from Ohio? If you're not from the United States? And when I say name, I mean at least be able to roughly locate them. Hundreds of places in California. Hundreds of places in New York State. Hundreds of places in Texas. There's some states that are a little bit more boring than these, almost like foundational ones. Hundreds of places in Illinois, because there's lots of places around Chicago and stuff like that. Hundreds of places in Massachusetts. Very small state, but quite densely populated. Very exciting place. There's lots of educational institutes in the institutions, I should say, in the Boston area. Not just, well, in Boston itself there are many, but Boston's relatively constricted.
And sometimes that your knowledge of where things are and love of atlases and whatever comes in handy when we go on road trips.
It helps sometimes, exactly right. I mean, one of the things, if I get lost or something like that driving, I just go, okay, I know roughly where I'm going. And just don't get panicked. You just improvise.
But sometimes, if he's in a place like, say, northern Saskatchewan, you don't want him to drive. Because he'll decide, oh, I haven't been on this road before, and I want to see what this area looks like. And
that's not improvised, incidentally. But,
no, it's not improvised. No. He's planned this out. And
the one thing you can't tell from maps is how good how good the roads are, how well maintained they are. And sometimes the maps are wrong. The worst.
I know, but if you've already learned from southern Saskatchewan that the roads are, honestly, if they're not a main road, you're probably better off if they're not paved.
Anyway,
because at one time they were paved, but now they're just a bunch of potholes.
They're poorly maintained. So don't elect, this is for Saskatchewan, but for other places too, BC, Manitoba. Don't elect United Conservative parties, Alberta too, where they've united with other parties because they tend to be, Conservative Party out here tends to be pretty conservative, or traditionally, the Progressive Conservative Party was pretty regressive here, but then they've united with the Liberal Party, and you think in places, like in Saskatchewan, BC I think as well too, and they became, instead of becoming a little more liberal, they became even more illiberal. So, and one of the things they've done very poorly is maintain infrastructure. And it's shocking to drive on some of the relatively back roads. Relatively, I say. Highway number 4, I believe it is, south of Swift Current, is a revelation. 4, something with that low a number.
Only the antelope should bother traveling in there.
It's a shockaroo. You end up, it's like a slalom, trying to avoid the potholes in the road. Potholes are as big as cauldrons. They should be calling cauldron holes. I'm just going to check and see if I remember that correctly. I can't see it terribly well. Does this say 4 here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 4. South of Swift Current, going down to Val Marie. It's pretty good until you get about to Highway 13. And that's an east-west highway, as I recall. Goes through Weyburn, goes over further east. Does it go through Carlisle? I believe so. To the Manitoba border, and then I think it turns into, can't be Highway 2, maybe Highway 2 or 3 in Manitoba. Anyway, Highway 13 is relatively well maintained, at least on the stretches that I've been on. But 4 is scary, going down to Belle-Marie, place where Brian Trottier came from. I don't know if he was born there. I hate the Islanders. I think it was a little too vicious for my taste with a stick, but very effective hockey player. The Montreal Canadiens, my favorite team, long term in hockey, had a chance to draft him. He was drafted quite low, and boy, did they make a mistake not drafting that guy. But they could have drafted Mike Bossy. Instead, they chose Mark Napier. Mark Napier is a pretty good player, nothing like Mike Bossy. Maybe the best pure shooter, goal scorer ever in the NHL. Awesome release. Everyone's yipping and yapping about Ovechkin. If someone hadn't smashed up Bossy's back, Bossy would hold those records for goal scoring, leading the league in goal scoring, I think. And he was playing during the time of Gretzky. It was Ovechkin playing with him. Anyway, enough of that little sideline there. So, I'm not trying to shut you guys up. I'm trying to get you guys to get your noses to the grindstone, exercise a little bit of elbow grease, and get your noses into books.
Yeah, well, lately what he's been doing is going through, like, getting statistical information for places. And then, so he has an idea of the culture of various places, and trying to come up with hypothesis for why things may be different in different places.
Even in the United States, in the cities.
Yeah.
You know, when people going around saying,
What's the demographic?
Yeah, Minneapolis is such a benighted place. You know, this is where George Floyd was martyred and all this sort of stuff. I already looked at some stats. You know, you look at the crew of 4 folks, the cops that were involved with that. Can't even call it murder by cop. It was suicide by drugs by George Floyd. I think based on Minneapolis's mixture of race, blacks were, if you give a half account for, what was his name, Kung something or other, half a black, then blacks were represented proportionally. If you call them all black, then they were overrepresented on that crew. Orientals were overrepresented. Whites were underrepresented. I'm sorry to have to point this out. In terms of police chiefdom, blacks were severely overrepresented. The police chief of Minneapolis is black. So Minnesota has a record going back to the 60s, probably earlier than that, of being pretty liberal. Hubert Humphrey was pretty liberal. Came from there. Eugene McCarthy, who was, I suspect, illiberally liberal, came from there as well. I believe they were senators. So, it's hard to buffalo me. The way so many people buffalo themselves and then try to buffalo other people, and they tend to do a very good job. And so they end up with like a tulip bubble, It becomes, but it's a moral panic, They buy into stupid theories about, they're basically like conspiracy theories. Oh, the Catholic Church is committing a genocide. Well, that's one of the wackiest conspiracy theories ever. What percentage would they have in whacking their own people, Catholic? And Doesn't make sense. Have they done that elsewhere? How how did they become the biggest church in the world up until recently, when the Pope fairly recently said, "Okay, we're not the biggest church in the world." Yeah, you still are, because you still are the bigger than the Sunnis. That won't last that long, but he said Muslims, there are more Muslims than there are Catholics. So how'd they become that way? Well, they were reasonably tolerant of indigenous beliefs and stuff like that. They allowed a certain degree of syncretism, so on and so forth. So what happened was the resident schools was awful. One might call taking the children away from their parents a crime against humanity. But to call that a genocide is just gross overstatement. I mean gross in at least two senses of the word. It's absolutely shameful. It itself is a hate crime,
there
to use that
are
term.
other religions in the world,
Or
which
belief
is
systems.
basically convert or else.
Yeah, like communism is that way. Belief system.
But
And there's one other big
has
one.
not been that way.
No.
I mean, for one thing, Christianity, it's the Christians are trying to save people's souls for the afterlife. So there's no, even if a person isn't converted to Christianity right away, there's always hope along the way that the Christians will be able to save their soul at some point, right? So it doesn't make sense for them to kill them off before their souls are saved. If they did that, that wouldn't be very Christian-like of them. That's totally against their whole
basic ethos.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there
have
been
all sorts of bad Christians.
Yes, there have been times in history when certain people, certain groups were brought into the Catholic fold, and it took a while for them to become less aggressive, say, and less motivated to...
Like the Romans themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, they basically took over the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
They, to a large extent, just created it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I won't say all downhill from there, but it was severely downhill from Constantine.
I don't know. I think, it's interesting that the Romans... It was an interesting move for the Romans. I don't know. It was like...
They had no choice.
If you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing, or whatever.
Well, it's we are getting
them.
Beaten by them. Let's take it over.
Yeah.
So Christians were taking over anyway. Mm-hmm. So when you get people saying Muhammad had to react against the powers that be in Mecca, or else he would have died, and his religion would have died with him. This is around 622 AD. This is almost 2/3 of a millennium, not century, after Jesus. And if not the most